Receiving incoming transmission.
Incoming transmission.
Incoming transmission.
I'm sure you have many questions.
Transmission.
Transmission.
Welcome to Transmission, a monthly show about the most impactful posts from our Meteor.js forums. My name is Paul Dowman, founder at OKGrow, and each month I am joined by Sashko Stubilo and other guests from the Meteor development group. Please note the contents of this show are the sole opinions of their authors. This show is sponsored by Meteor Galaxy Hosting, a containerized cloud service specifically designed and engineered for Meteor app deployment. Learn more at meteor.com/galaxy. This show is also sponsored by OKGrow, an official Meteor Prime consulting partner building full-stack web and mobile apps. Learn more at okgrow.com. Welcome to Transmission number 22. I'm Paul Dowman. I'm the founder of OKGrow, where we help clients build great apps with Meteor, and I'm joined by Jesse Rosenberger and Ben Newman of Meteor Development Group. Welcome, guys.
Hi, glad to be here.
Thanks
How's
for
it going,
joining
Paul?
me.
Good to see you.
Thanks for doing this. I'm pretty excited right now because not only have we just released Meteor 1.6, not we, you guys, not only have you just given us Meteor 1.6, but you've also just passed 1,000 releases on GitHub. That's pretty awesome. And so by releases, I mean literally the GitHub releases feature where it's like tag release. This is not like 1,000 commits or anything. I think that was a long time ago.
Yep.
So, but literally 1,000 actual releases, and I think that's a testament to, like, first of all, how much you guys have done, how much work you guys have done, and also to how well you guys actually provide public access to pre-release versions of things. So there's always been a lot of early releases, a lot of like public testing of pre-release versions. So I'm like, kudos for that.
Yeah. While I've been at the company, there's definitely been a shift from Meteor Development Group trying to do all the testing and get everything right before releasing anything, which meant like everyone in the company dropping everything else and doing manual testing for several days. And we've moved to a system where we put out pre-release versions frequently and early, and anyone having a problem with the latest version or just curious about what's coming next can try it, and that gives us a whole lot more breadth in terms of usage in like real apps and feedback. So by the time we're finished with a release, we've done a bunch of pre-releases, and I think the results speak for themselves in terms of stability.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's a more scalable way of doing things, and actually, I said always in my earlier sentence there, but I actually, that's not true. Like I do remember, like, since I've been involved with Meteor, there actually, like in recent years, there has been a noticeable culture change in terms of like all kinds of openness, and I think it's also in line with the JavaScript community getting bigger and bigger, and everything just sort of scaling in all kinds of ways. And so, yeah, so that's awesome. Congrats on that. So I would love to hear a bit about Meteor 1.6. You guys wrote a blog post with all the details that everybody should take a look at, but do you want to just do a bit of a rundown on like what's the main new features?
Sure. I mean, the biggest high-level change is that we jumped from Node 4, which is sort of in the twilight of its long-term support status, all the way to Node 8, which is now the latest LTS version of Node. There's also a Node 9, but Node does this thing where odd versions are considered experimental, and then at some point they just get bumped up to the next even version. So Node. But for now, we're basically on the latest version of Node, which has all sorts of great benefits.
Cool. Benefits like performance.
Yeah. Performance for almost for free in a lot of cases. There's a totally different optimizing compiler in the V8 engine. I believe it's V8 version 6.1 now. Ignition and turbofan are two words for two aspects of that compiler. We talk about it in the blog post, although I'm now not remembering exactly what each of those is respectively. Anyway, for a long time, Node developers have had this sort of secret knowledge of optimization killers, micro optimization intuitions, using a try catch block is going to mean the function won't be JIT optimized, or using the arguments object in a weird way will slow your code down. And all of those micro optimization intuitions were based on the architecture of previous versions of V8. So, everything you thought you knew about quirks of V8 performance is probably worth revisiting. But the net of it is that far fewer of those things that you used to have to avoid are still problematic. So in a lot of cases, code that you hadn't bothered optimizing is just faster now because it's not suffering from those problems.
Cool. So maybe time to go and take a look at all those weird hacks that you may have put in. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, as usual, with any kind of fine performance tuning, you need to do some profiling, figure out what parts of the code are both slow and heavily used. There's no point in doing a sweep over your code base and trying to change something everywhere that you think might benefit performance without doing measurement first.
Yep.
And that actually is a nice segue into the new debugging experience based on the Node inspector. This was released first in the late versions of Node 7, but it's been in Node 8, all 15 or 16 versions of Node 8. And it's basically, in Meteor, you can run your app with Meteor run -- inspect - break or -- inspect. And those flags will start Meteor in a mode where the V8 debugger is enabled. And instead of starting the Node inspector server, which used to serve an HTML and CSS copy or knockoff of the Chrome DevTools, actually open up Chrome DevTools or Visual Studio Code or WebStorm, any number of debugging clients, and connect to your server-side code and debug it using a native interface. And it just has far fewer bugs than the old Node inspector. And what's really amazing about it is that there's also no real performance penalty for running your app in debugging mode, which means, among other things, you can do realistic performance and memory profiling of server-side code through the Node inspector. So, if you're looking for ways to speed up your code now that Node 8 is here, that is a great way to get some insight into where it's slow. And that was never possible, at least in an accurate way before.
And it's really nice seeing some of the integrations that exist around the Chrome debugging protocol too. Visual Studio Code users have been pretty happy lately because they can actually, within their IDE, and the other IDE support this as well, can just basically put a launch.json file into their VS Code configuration in their project and do debugging directly in the application in the code that they're editing. Whereas previously, you could still do some sort of real-time code edits and things like that, but you'd have to do it through your browser's developer tools. And some of the integrations that are out there now are very nice. So it's exciting. And Node has Node 8, I think during the LTS for Node 8, Node is committed to updating V8 as well to another higher version as well. I think currently it's coming with V8 6.1.
6.1.
And I think they're talking about including 6.2 as well. So hopefully we'll see some more improvements in coming releases of Node as well.
Cool.
Yep.
I understand there's also some improvements for Windows users of Meteor as well, so that's something that a lot of people will be interested in.
We certainly hope
Definitely.
so. We spent a good portion of time going through a wide variety of Windows bugs, everything from the installation experience to file system issues that previously weren't necessarily happening to us. Like we do use Meteor under Windows occasionally, but it's not as regular as a lot of developers, so we don't get the same experience. But we had some great community members who came together and really laid those problems out for us and let us really attack them. And first and foremost, we decided to just get rid of the existing Windows installer completely. Not only did it have a couple problems with it, but we introduced a 64-bit version of Windows with Meteor 1.6. Sorry, a 64-bit version of Meteor with Meteor 1.6, which is hopefully going to be a vastly improved experience for Windows users. Previously, Windows had to resort to using its WoW64 emulation for running Meteor because there was only 32-bit binaries under the hood. And Windows did an amazing job at using the 32-bit version of those, probably so well that it put off the need for us to do this for quite a while. But I think the experience there should be a lot better. And the new installer is a Chocolatey package. So Chocolatey is a pretty popular package manager for Windows. I was just looking at some numbers for it earlier, and since they released their new version in August, it's had like 7 million downloads or something like that. I was actually pretty surprised by the numbers there. But the Meteor package is now just the Chocolatey package, so you can just do Choco install Meteor, and if you're on a 64-bit platform, it'll install a 64-bit version of Meteor.
Cool. Good to hear that a lot of that was driven by community members. That's, like I said a few minutes ago, that's something that I've really noticed in the last couple of years is just the more open way that you guys are developing stuff, and that's a major part of it, is that there's been a lot more contribution from outside of MVG. Yeah.
A community member, Bruce Johnson, is a Windows user and really came through towards the end of the 1.6 release process, just like surfacing every kind of pain he was feeling as a Windows developer on Meteor. And, it's true that we don't get the same volume of feedback from Windows developers as we do from Mac and Linux developers. But if you get, one good, like, representative user who is willing to tell you everything that's wrong, and you make that person happy, chances are you've made a lot of other people in a similar situation happy as well. So it's, going from 0 to 1 in terms of community feedback is the biggest step, and I think we can credit him largely for the debugging experience, for example, being as good as it is on Windows in Meteor 1.6.
Awesome.
And I should add, the Chocolatey installer is open source now, and it's just a PowerShell script essentially. So we already had a contributor come to the table with a bug with installing on Windows 7 because it uses an older version of PowerShell. They submitted a PR to the Meteor Chocolatey installer repository and merged it, and it solved the problem. So there's already a new beta out for that, and things like that are super helpful.
Awesome. That's great. Well, so the other question I had about Meteor 1.6 is, it's not necessarily 1.6 specific thing, but just, you guys have been doing a lot of improvements in terms of like just the core infrastructure of things. Meteor is now a really good alternative to, say, using Webpack for running just as a JavaScript environment. But and you guys have done a lot of work on things like the code splitting, support for server-side rendering. I'm not sure that it's clear to everybody, even in the Meteor community, but especially outside, like what you need to do to take advantage of these types of things. Like, is that something that you could just elaborate on for a minute or two?
Sure.
Like how much of SSR? So I understand, for example, sorry to jump back in. SSR is not just for React. Like there's actually in theory some general support for SSR, but I don't know, maybe just give us a little bit of an overview on all that stuff.
Sure. Well, of the two things you mentioned, dynamic imports and server-side rendering, dynamic imports is, I suppose, easier to explain how you would get started using it. Basically, instead of using require or import declarations, you use the import function. Looks like a function call. So import followed by an open paren, followed by a string literal, module identifier, close paren. And that works as an expression. It returns a promise for the exports, well, actually for the namespace object of that module. So basically, if you're willing to deal with the promise API, that gives you a way to postpone loading the code for modules that you may not need immediately until you actually need them. So, of course, a convenient place to put those dynamic imports is in your router code. So, depending on which route you actually end up executing, you load, potentially a totally different tree of components. And you don't have to go through and use dynamic imports everywhere. If you just use a dynamic import for the root of a dependency tree, then everything that it depends on that wasn't already included in the bundle for some other reason will also be loaded dynamically. So you get a lot of benefit from it very quickly if you focus on like the root of your dependency tree. And what's really cool about all that is Meteor apps are able to assume that they have a persistent WebSocket open. And so we fetch those dynamic modules in a single request. We don't have to wait for some of them to come back to figure out what their dependencies are and then do this waterfall thing. Fetch everything you need that you don't already have and only what you don't already have over the WebSocket. So that has a lot of the same benefits that HTTP2 response multiplexing would theoretically have, but the latency is lower. We can do fancy things like compressing the entire response with gzip instead of each module individually. And that all just works with no configuration whatsoever. You don't have to think about how your modules are being grouped into bundles because we don't use bundles. That whole concept that people struggle with in Webpack just goes away if you're requesting exactly the modules that you need over a WebSocket. So that's the sales pitch there. That was the headline feature of Meteor 1.5. So I know that people have figured out how to use that, but if it's still on your to-do list just over the horizon, I think it'll be a pretty good experience. Basically just start using dynamic imports and also use the bundle visualizer, which is described in the Meteor 1.5 blog post to make sure that the consequences of making modules dynamic actually are happening as expected in terms of the size of your JavaScript bundle.
Cool. So
yeah, that's my spiel about dynamic imports. You were also asking about server-side rendering. So traditionally, Meteor has been focused on building single-page applications where most of the logic, at least as far as the UI is concerned, happens on the client side. You just send data over and you load some like static JavaScript resources, and then you put the data into the rendering code and it builds a UI for you. But all of that happens on the client, and so you're potentially waiting until the client has loaded everything before you see anything on the page. You don't get the benefit of the original HTML document, including any of the UI of your app. So around the same time that 1.6 was, well, now I'm forgetting when exactly we introduced this. Anyway, there is a new core package called Server Render, and it exports a function called onPageLoad. And so in your server code, you can pass a callback to that onPageLoad API, and your callback will be called for every request with an object that we call the sink, as in something that you put stuff into that, I guess, drains somewhere. That's the metaphor. I couldn't think of a better noun, but that's what it is. And the sink has a request property. So if you need information about the request, like the current URL or cookies, that sort of thing, you have access to that. But it also has a couple of methods currently, just a small set of methods, one for appending HTML to the head of the document, one for appending to the body, and a third for rendering HTML into an element with a particular DOM ID, right? So it's designed to do the kinds of things that you want to do when you're server rendering some HTML. It's not actually a document object. It's really more of a means of scheduling these operations to happen before the response gets sent back to the client. So I think of it as a fundamental building block for future server-side rendering abstractions, but it is definitely lacking some sort of additional functionality that you might expect to be present. So, for example, with the current accounts packages, the logged in user information, session token, is stored on the client in local storage. So to be quite honest, you have to load JavaScript on the client to look at local storage, which can then tell the server over a WebSocket who the logged in user is, right? And unfortunately, that happens after the response has been rendered by the server. So what that means is the server render abstraction doesn't have any information about the logged in user, and therefore can't render UI that's tailored to a specific logged in user. It's still useful, I think, to render a generic shell, and I say generic because it's not based on any particular user's login information. If you think about like a progressive web application that renders a shell and then does a follow-up request to hydrate that application shell with data, that's exactly what you're able to do with this abstraction. Yeah. You can render the shell. You can, if you're using React, you can hydrate that to hook up event listeners and stuff, and then get some actual data on a per user basis and fill everything in.
And one major reason why people want to have server-side rendering is for web crawlers and other types of things, which are generally, not generally, they're not going to be getting logged in version of the page anyway. So it solves that problem. Yeah, that's great.
And I should mention it's super tempting because people have been asking for it to imagine putting information about the logged in user into a cookie so that it gets sent with the request, and so that the server rendering code can use that. But it's tricky. It's tricky to take code that doesn't know anything about the logged in user and safely switch it over to code that can use potentially privileged information. Mm-hmm. You may have been caching some of the things that you rendered, and if you're not careful to invalidate the cache when the logged in user changes, you might end up showing a cache version for another user to the current user, and that's bad. So I don't know, if you're going to have to sort of carefully think about how you do your per user rendering anyway, it might be worth switching to an accounts abstraction that works better with server rendering out of the box. For instance, if you're using Apollo, you could argue it works better with server rendering because it has the option of sending a cookie, and also the way that you use GraphQL to get your data looks exactly the same on the server as it does on the client. So when your server rendering, your data fetching code can be really and truly isomorphic if you're using GraphQL as an abstraction. And in traditional Meteor, there's not really a server-side mini Mongo, and the actual Mongo query API is a little bit different from mini Mongo, so there's just sort of a mismatch there. The server rendering abstraction is a building block. We hope to see it develop and have other things built on top of it, but it's definitely forward-looking and not immediately a complete solution for any kind of server-side rendering that you might want to do today.
But you can build any type of other server-side rendering on top of Meteor right now. So, for example, if people are already using Apollo, like we do at OKGrow, that's actually a great segue to something else that people have been asking a lot. There's a huge thread right now in the forums about what's next for Meteor in 1.7, and so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah.
1.7 and beyond.
I don't know if we need to jump to 1.7 yet. I think we still have some asphalt to put down in 1.6. I think one of our important things for Meteor in general is to make it possible to easily adopt it. Right now, Meteor is something that you kind of need to go all in for, and I think we'd like to loosen that up a little bit. Something that's been kind of tossed around recently is the idea of adding Meteor onto an existing project. There's lots of ways that you can kind of piece together different parts of different servers and stuff into a single application. Apollo is a perfect example of how you can just add a middleware into like an application that you already have, either an Express application or otherwise, and then just have that server operating within it as a middleware. And there's definitely a thought process here where we're trying to figure out if that's a possibility for Meteor. There's a lot of concerns that go into that as far as how we deal with reactively building your code in the background while it's operating, especially in development. But that's certainly a really interesting direction that would make it a little bit more digestible for people who want to just get started with Meteor, and if they already have an application and they want to take advantage of some of the Meteor's power without diving all the way into the pool.
Yeah, I mean, there's two different versions of that. One is taking parts of Meteor to be able to use in your app, like maybe you just want to pull in live query or a mini Mongo or something from NPM into an existing Node or JavaScript app. But the other side of that is using Meteor, like the build system of Meteor, or just kind of Meteor's like base core JavaScript infrastructure, but having that still be from NPM. And so, like, to be honest, that looks hard. It's hard for somebody coming from the JavaScript world now who's used to NPM being their thing. Like, if there's something new, they expect to just NPM install X. And with Meteor, you have to have a separate NPM. So that I know is on your roadmap, and I'm personally super excited about that.
Yeah, it's something that we have in the roadmap in a section titled, I think it's Remove Blockers to Meteor Adoption. And full migration to NPM is a fantastic idea. I wrote a blog post recently called Know Your Node, which was about why we pin node versions in Meteor and how we have like this concept of the dev bundle and things like that. And as we've kind of been working on breaking apart pieces of Meteor, we certainly have come to appreciate some of the true strengths of having it be like a dev bundle that you install directly into your development environment. And some of the benefits include just overall stability. We know exactly what version of Node and NPM that you're using, and we're able to design exactly for that version without having to worry if you're running a version of Node that has a known bug that could be just wreaking havoc in your project and you don't even know it. We know, and all of our developers use the same version of Node if they're on the same version of Meteor, so we can really kind of triangulate those problems and figure out if there's really an issue that we can fix. We had a garbage collection issue recently that with enough users using the same version of Node, running into the same problem, we knew that we had an issue and we could track it down. So I think I think developers would be pretty open to the idea, and by all means, let us know what your feedback is on this, Twitter or otherwise. Middleware it's a pretty decent option for that. It's something that you could just tack onto an existing project. It might not be just an npm install, but maybe it's just adding a couple lines to an Express project, and then you have a basic functioning Meteor application.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit of color to that, the fact that Meteor, as it's currently designed, uses a specific version of Node for each Meteor release is not necessarily in conflict with a developer's choice of some other version of Node for their application. You could imagine this middleware being designed such a way that it starts a separate Meteor process, running its own specific version of Node, and then the Express server in the parent process, the existing app, talks to that process over interprocess communication channels, and gets sent back the streaming output of the Meteor web server. That process can be responsible for WebSocket traffic, for example. And so now you've got Meteor retaining its assumptions, its sort of tight control over what it thinks the Node environment should look like, guarantees like, there is an HTTP2 built-in module available, because, that's new in Node 8. And you also get the benefit of multi-processing, just true parallelism between your existing app and the Meteor process. So it's not just like competing over an event loop. It's literally like sending information about the request to the Meteor process, and Meteor doing some server-side rendering or what have you off in its own process, sending data back while the original process continues doing whatever it's doing. And so that would, I think, not only allow Meteor to sort of continue living inside of its own world, but make better use of system resources and make things a little bit more isolated. So you're not like dumping a bunch more stuff into your Node environment beyond adding a bit of middleware to your Express server.
Interesting. Cool. Well, I'm excited to see where that's going. Okay, we're sort of running out of time. There's been there were a ton of things that people have requested, so I apologize, we're not going to get to all of them, but there's just a couple other hot topics that I feel like we should probably touch on. Related to future Meteor stuff, there was talk about a new MongoDB change notification stream API, so this could potentially in the future be a replacement for the oplog, which is kind of it's kind of like oversubscribing. So maybe you guys could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, my take on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Well, I'll be brief. I think you know more about this than I do, Jesse, but there is a great comment in the feature request thread from Christian Klossner, who sort of cut through a lot of the speculation about how awesome this new API would be and figured out like what it would mean concretely. And sort of TLDR is the new change notifications API seems like it'll be good for watching for changes to fields like the ID property of Mongo documents, or rather subscribing to changes based on document IDs. But it is unfortunately not so good for subscribing to changes in terms of fields that are themselves changing over time. So, a document's ID stays the same from the beginning, and so it makes sort of a stable subscription hook. But other fields might change, and so it's less clear how that API would work in those cases. And all of that means that it seems like the oplog may remain useful for many kinds of data.
Yeah, I think it will for the foreseeable future. I think, just to real briefly add on to that, there was still some limitations within the current implementation as far as like number of watchers. Like I think it was still only at like 1,000. It's like a recommended number that MongoDB had implemented. So still not infinite. Still some situations that may arise there. It could become handy for like cache invalidation for Apollo integrations. There's some possibilities there, but yeah, I really big shout out to the community for working together on that feature request to kind of hash out some of the details and figuring out feasibility.
Cool. Okay. Well, interesting. I mean, I guess there's a ton of other like possible future things to talk about, but I probably should move on a little bit, wrap it up in a couple minutes here. Okay. I want to quickly touch on the security vulnerability that happened a couple months ago. I want to say that you guys handled it really well. There was a vulnerability related to the allow deny rules in Meteor, and MDG did some behind the scenes work to fix that very, very quickly. Coordinate with the community. I think like that was done very fast and very responsibly. So I don't know if there's anything else to say on that, unless you have any comments.
Just make sure you're using.
Yeah, not too much.
Yeah, either don't use allow deny, or be using allow deny 1.0.9 or later. That's the TLDR. Cool.
Okay. There was, geez, let's see what else. There were so many things. There was a good article that was discussed on the forums about a scaling success story for Meteor in production. There's just some good, I want to just give a shout out about that because there were some good tips on how to configure your Meteor app for at least moderate scaling.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody wrote a Galaxy auto scaling package, so I thought that was pretty cool. Galaxy doesn't have auto scaling as a built-in feature, but somebody wrote a package that uses Phantom.js and WebDriver and actually scrapes the UI and tells it to scale up based on some metrics. So, awesome.
Yeah, both of those articles are really interesting articles. The scaling article, as far as like demonstrating proof of concept scaling, fantastic outline with lots of great data points, and it shows that you can actually scale just fine, as long as you make certain considerations about the data that you're moving around. And as far as the Galaxy auto scaling, that's definitely a feature that I think is on the Galaxy team's roadmap. I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I do think that it was a very we will be working towards some opportunities for better integrations, so you don't have to do things like Phantom.js scraping of the Galaxy control panel. That's there's actually already a solution in place for that. We just need to make it a little bit more well documented, and we're going to get that done.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, and also I got to point out that auto scaling is really hard because the metrics of what makes sense in any app to auto scale, like, having tried this, it's very different depending on what your app is. So you can't just scale based on like some general arbitrary metrics. Like, it's going to have to be custom.
Right.
Sometimes the best scaling is when you're just clicking the up button yourself. Like you know you need it.
Yep. Okay, I think we should wrap it there because that's been more than half an hour, and this has been awesome. Thank you guys. So great discussion about what's happening next. I I hope we don't go as long as it took for the last one, but I'll post a thread in the forums when we're getting ready to start the next one, and everybody's feedback would be really appreciated.
Yep.
Sounds great.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us, Paul.
Thanks, guys. See you in the Meteor forums.